A Numerate Life, a mathematician explores the vagaries of life, his own and probably yours.
Hi, I'm Glen Whitney from the National Museum of Mathematics, and I'm here with John Allen Paulos, the author of A Numerate Life. And we're going to talk a bit about the book today and about some of its ramifications on a larger spheres. How are you doing today, John?
I'm doing fine. It's good to be with you in this somewhat Pickwickian sense.
Right. So, in reading A Numerate Life, one thing that I was struck by is how skeptical you seem to be about the notion of recording a life, of doing biography in the first place. And it seems that a couple of different mathematical principles have led you to that point of view. Do you think that's fair? And why does math make you a skeptic in this regard?
I think it is fair. I mean, I call the book a quasi-memoir or even an anti-memoir. And I'm dubious of the whole biographical endeavor, despite this, in a sense, being one, for several reasons. One is just everyday talk with people. I often hear that so-and-so does this, he or she is nasty, is always doing this, and I meet so-and-so, and it's perfectly fine. Or the other way around. Oh, he's a wonderful person, and the other way around. And if you listen to a poll, I mean, we're in election season now, and you find out that the sample space was 3, you might not be really impressed with the results of that poll. In general, I mean, what do you do when you tell a story? A biography is a kind of a story, and a kind of standard console that one offers in many kinds of stories is to suspend disbelief, to go with the flow, so as to continue and derive maximum pleasure for it. Whereas in science, statistics, science in general, the idea is to suspend belief. You don't want to be bamboozled. You don't want to be fooled. You don't want to make a type 1 error, a false positive, saying something's there when it's not, whereas storytelling is just the opposite. You don't want to make a type 2 error, saying something's not there when it really is. And for lots of reasons. I mean, another one is just the complexity of human beings and their interactions. It's hard to capture in any sort of compelling way. I mean, one thing people do when they write biographies is vaguely analogous to what people do when they construct surfaces of best fit through a multidimensional space. You use certain statistical techniques, but in doing so, you have lots of data points off the surface, and if there are too many, it's not a very good surface. The surface of best fit isn't very good. But in biography, I mean, again, I'm using the notion metaphorically. You construct the surface of best fit that captures the life in some kind of graspable narrative. But you, of course, are going to leave out things, and what you leave out is often the essence of life. I mean, I think many biographies would be improved were they to include, so-and-so did this wonderful fellow, but he did this horrible thing, or he's a horrible fellow, but yet he did this wonderful thing. But in general, I'm dubious for a lot of psychological reasons, some mathematical ones that I talk about in the book. And in fact, the structure of the book is it's funny because I'm making eye contact only with myself. But the structure of the book is I talk about certain vignettes, experiences in my life, and use them as jumping off points to discuss mathematical notions that are relevant to the telling of the life stories of anybody, not just me. I mean, the subtitle of the book is A Mathematician Explores the Vagaries of Life, his own and probably yours.
So if, as you say, the surface of best fit that a biographer tries to create for another person has somehow missed the essence of that person's life, doesn't that just mean that that biographer is oversimplified? That mathematically speaking, the biographer could have gone to a surface of higher degree and therefore properly captured the being, or are we, for some reason, always doomed to fall short, no matter how high-ordered an approximation we try to make?
I think to some extent we're always going to fall short for complexity theoretic reasons. I mean, the complexity of anyone's life is much greater than can be captured in 300 pages. And as a result, I mean, as I said, any biography is going to leave out significant and interesting results. I mean, one thing I talk about in the book is a kind of mathematical explication of the quip that my father used to always cite, which is the following. There are two types of people in the world, the very strange ones and those we don't know very well. And one way to kind of get at that mathematically is imagine a straight line 10 inches long and cut off the half inch on either end, the extreme ends. So it's 9 inches. Now look at a square that's 10 inches on a side. Cut off half an inch around each of the four sides. And that's the central part. 9 times 9 constitutes 81% of the whole thing. Look at a three-dimensional cube, 9 by 9, 10 by 10 by 10. Cut off the half inch around there, and you get 73% approximately the interior, 27% on the edge. But there's so many dimensions along which we can measure people. And the higher the dimension of the hypercube, the more likely it is that a person is going to be on the extreme end of many of these dimensions. And in fact, all of us, if you take into, you put some constraints on what you're going to count as a dimension, all of us are in the extreme edge of this multidimensional hypercube, or hypersphere, if you like that better. So we're all, in this sense, very strange. And you can do it the same thing probabilistically. And there are examples I cite in the book. When I was in graduate school at the University of Wisconsin, there was this guy who always wore a suit and tie. He was very conventional, banal, never said anything interesting. And one day I was in downtown Madison, and I saw him around the corner of a building, kind of hidden, and he was giggling, and I stood around wondering. It turns out that he had shellacked a $20 bill or $10 bill, I forget, to the sidewalk, and people would come by and try to pick it up, and they couldn't. It was shellac. And he thought that was hilarious. And just one example. I mean, anybody can cite countless examples where someone is not the way they appear. And so we are all strange, and that's kind of almost literally true, that there's a very strange people and people we don't know very well. Along most dimensions, people are, in the interior, but there are many dimensions, which put them at the edge.
So is there a positive spin on that it's not worth trying to fit in? It's not that we shouldn't spend our lives worrying about being normal because in the end there's no way we're going to be?
I don't know about that. I mean, most of us along most dimensions probably are, but even Charles Manson, I'm sure, is normal along most dimensions. But I mean, even this story that broke a few days ago about the doctor at Mount Sinai who took advantage, allegedly, of a student of a woman who he drugged with morphine or whatever. I mean, if that's true, I mean, he was this wonderful fellow. He was very well known in emergency room reform. I mean, it hasn't come to trial, so I don't want to prejudge. But if it is, it's just one of a zillion examples, if I may cite a made-up number word.
Right. So both you and I have a little bit of background in logic, and so I was interested to see that you talk in your book about non-standard models of axioms and how that somehow, provides a cautionary note or idea for the endeavor of biography. Might you explain a little bit about what a non-standard model is and how it connects to what you're doing in a Numerate life?
Sure. A non-standard model of a set of axioms is a model which is not expected, but it does satisfy the axioms. An example I use is somebody goes to a computer eHarmony or whatever computing dating service, and he wants somebody who's short, likes formal attire, likes cold weather, is gregarious, and on. And the computer sends him a penguin. Oh, who, who satisfies all those conditions. So no matter how you try to capture a life, I mean, the way I use it in the book is you look at the, first 15 years of a person's life, 18 years, through high school, and you kind of construct an idea of what the person's like. And then when you get to be my advanced age, you find them. I'm not on Facebook, but I'm in contact with a lot of people. You find that their life has turned out very different than what you might have expected, given the, in some sense, axioms of the initial part of their life. So in that sense, our later lives are a kind of a joke. I mean, a joke is a non-standard model, as the Penguin showed, of a set of axioms. And in this kind of strange sense, our life is a kind of joke, because you can to some extent, but often the initial description of a person's life, I mean, Barack Obama didn't do particularly well in high school until he got serious in the second year of college. I just read an article. But forget that. I mean, everybody knows many examples, and people do much better than you might have expected, much worse, and many other more refined words than just better or worse. And so their later life is, as I said, a non-standard model. I mean, you can't even capture the notion, as you know, of the integers because of so-called Lowenheim-Skolem theorem. You can have an uncountable model of the integers, and that's not what people intuitively have in mind when you write out the piano axioms. So in that sense, as I said, we're jokes. Our lives are jokes.
Right. So it's a little hopeless to put people in a box, and try as you might, they'll surprise you by not being inside the box you thought you had them in. Is that kind of the moral?
Yes. It is a kind of strange thesis that kind of lurks in the book that is essentially an anti-memoir memoir. But, I mean, it has elements of memoir in it. I talk, for example, of how I helped very inadvertently George Bush become president in 2000.
Oh, dear.
And and I use that. Well, I mean, let me tell you briefly the story. That, as you remember, in Florida, it was essentially a tie. There was approximately 6 million votes counted, cast, and about 3 million for each of them. And the difference between them, official difference, was a few hundred. If you flip a coin 6 million times, it would have been a bigger difference between the number of heads and the number of tails. And there are all these imponderables, hanging chads and missing ballots and military ballots and shenanigans of one sort or another. So I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times in which I said the electoral apparatus in Florida, though crucial to the outcome of the election, whoever won Florida would win the election, was much too gross to measure the fine differences, whatever they were, between them. It is a little bit like measuring bacteria with a yardstick. It's a kind of absurd undertaking. But I went on at the margin of victory was much smaller than the margin of error. In any case, the manual recount of certain counties in Florida was underway, and the Florida Supreme Court authorized that. But then the chief judge of the Florida Supreme Court nixed the continuing recount. He said, I read this op-ed by mathematician John Allen Paulos in the New York Times, and he says the margin of error is greater than the margin of victory. There's no fact of the matter, so why continue? It's just going to lead to greater vituperation, greater divisiveness, greater rancor, so he stopped it. And then, there was a whole bunch of legal maneuvering. It went to the Supreme Court, and Bush was elected, or maybe I should say selected, president. And, in those counties, most recounts after the fact had Bush winning by a few. But in the state as a whole, had they recanvassed the whole state, Gore would have won. And he did win 500,000 more votes nationwide. But in any case, given that it was such a gross electoral system, maybe flipping a commemorative coin in Tallahassee would have been fair, or a total recount.
So, in contemplating a biography, which certainly in which you certainly feature prominently, and you look back on that experience, do you regret having written those words? Do you feel that this is an unexpected outcome of your actions?
I definitely regret having written those words. I mean, you talk about the butterfly effect, tiny little variations in initial conditions cascading over a brief period of time into huge differences. I mean, there are lots of other butterflies. I mean, a much bigger butterfly was, this thing keeps falling out of my ear, a much bigger butterfly was Jeb Davis, and Secretary of Florida State, Catherine, I forget her name, Catherine Davis, and Jeb Bush. But, and you can't herd butterflies, so I don't really think I'm responsible, but nevertheless, it's unfortunate that the recount was stopped, at least in part because of this op-ed. So, justified or not, I do still occasionally have a pang of regret. I think if Gore had been elected, global warming initiatives would have been furthered, the Iraq War would have been much less likely, and so on.
So, on the other hand, isn't there a certain counterpoint where we might be sitting here having the same interview if you had decided not to wade into the issue, where you might be saying, if only I had spoken out? In other words, could it be a darned if you do, darned if you don't kind of situation?
Oh, of course. I mean, that's the nature of life. Yeah. I mean, you can always, look at anybody's life, any sequence of events. I mean, get back to biographies. I mean, let's say someone's writing about an affair. If the cheated upon spouse is the author, of course, it's going to have a certain
tang,
bilious flavor. And if it's the cheating so-called partner, it'll have a different one, self-justification or whatever. And if it's the outside lover, it will have yet a different flavor. If it's a so-called neutral observer, assuming there are some, probably not, it'll have a different flavor. So I don't want to be all Rashomon-y, but what's the truth? I mean, they're all the truths. I mean, a thought experiment I have in the book is to imagine a biography of Stephen Hawking written by Kim Kardashian. That'd be interesting, or the other way around, one of her written by him. So you can.
They might both be very short, mightn't they?
They probably would, but it'd be interesting to see each of their takes on the other, or just pick your own incongruous pairs of subjects and authors. And again, you probably shouldn't put a lot of credence into anything you read. I mean, people lie, or they don't lie, they embellish, or they're self-deluded, and nevertheless, I mean, I did write this memoir, so there are lots of stories of my life in there. So you can say, what about them? Yeah, okay, but this is my perspective, and there is some truth out there, but it comes in from different perspectives.
So as you were putting together all those vignettes that you just mentioned, did you ever find yourself, reflecting or thinking about what you had done and almost, being surprised or like, I would never do that?
Definitely. I look back at, my childhood. Now I'm kind of, in some sense, liberal with libertarian tendencies, but, in those days, and I drive a Volvo to be more stereotypical and da-da-da-da-da. But in those days, I would fill the ceiling of my bedroom with model airplanes. I'd make elaborate structures of armies attacking each other. And I loved World War II movies. And, that guy grew into this guy. In fact, sometimes when I think back, in writing the book, think back at events in my life, it almost requires an act of will on my part to realize that the person I'm talking about, writing about, is as me. I mean, I know it is. I mean, intellectually, but the mindset is sometimes very hard to get into.
And so, does mathematics have anything to say about how we change, or how we can understand how we change?
Well, I think there's some kind of gross similarities, gross invariances having to do with growing older, and there are many more choices in the beginning. There are fewer, no matter what option you take. Your options somewhat narrow as you get older. There are some vague similarities. In fact, I use the mathematical card trick known as the Crisco trick to kind of model why, after a while, even despite our earlier differences, as we get older, there is as I say, a gross similarity among people. And the card trick, as you might know, is you have a deck of cards, you shuffle, you tell somebody to pick, let's say, the third card, and you turn them over, and that's your secret number. And if that card is a 5, then as I turn over the cards one by one, the 5th card after that becomes your new secret number. And let's say that's a 7. I keep turning over cards. The 7th card after that might be a 2. You go ahead 2 cards. Anyway, if you do that, two people do that, no matter if they choose different cards in the beginning, they almost certainly will. After a while, they'll, by chance, happen to land on the same card. That's their secret card. And thereafter, this lockstep rule will take them to the same place. You can do the same thing with words. You look at a passage from the Bible, pick a word from the first 2 or 3 sentences. If it's got 8 letters, move ahead 8 words. If that word has 3 letters, move ahead 3 words. And by an artful choice of initial word, of passage rather, people can choose whatever they want as the initial word. But by an artful choice of passage, you can make sure everybody ends up on the word devil, for example. And to some, in some ways, life is like that. I mean, jadedness. I talk about jadedness. I've won in recent years a couple of awards from mass societies, Society for Advancement of Science, and so on. And that's nice. I'm flattered, but it also reminds me that you don't get awards unless you're getting old. So I have a discussion about jadedness, as you get older, the number of peak experiences, record performances becomes less frequent, and there are ways you can capture that mathematically. I mean, imagine flipping a coin, for example, 1,000 times, and you do it and you get 507 heads. Let's say that's a record number of heads. The next time you flip a coin 1,000 times, you might only get 499. Next time, 502. Next time, 506. And then the next time, 512. That's a new record. And then you keep on flipping a coin 1,000 times, recording the number of heads. The number of records becomes ever less frequent. In fact, the number of records, if you flip it, if you do something 1,000,000 times, you'll have about 14 records. So as you get older, I mean, for this reason and other psychological, biological reasons, records, peak performances, the best movie, the best record, the best restaurant become much less frequent. And the intensity of youth, which relies on the best of this, that, or the other thing, becomes less. I mean, the only records you keep on making are maybe the size of your ears or the or the area of your forehead, as you can see. So anyway.
And does the same thing work on the negative side? I mean, do we tend to have less stinging mistakes as we get older, fewer regrets as we get older? Or?
I think so. I think, but I'm not sure that's a good thing. But Bayes' theorem kicks in. I mean, I talk about romantic crushes. I mean, which, minimal interaction with the person, the way she rolls her eyes at somebody, or the way she does this or whatever, and you're smitten, and you're the prior of your, to use statistical terms, is is such that this is an idealized person. This is a wonderful person, wonderful man, wonderful woman. And but as you go on, I mean, also I talk about Kahneman thinking fast, thinking slow. The thinking fast part leads to a crush, not just in romantic context, but in science or math. You have a crush on a particular idea. It's called a hunch, my pet idea, whatever. And as you live with the person or whatever, your posterior evaluation changes. It doesn't mean it becomes negative. It just becomes deeper and fuller and so on. And I think we should cherish crushes of whatever sort because they're kind of the bubbling source of energy in our life, but also realize that after a while, if you use Bayes' theorem, which tells us how to reevaluate probabilities in general, you realize you've got to change, and the crush becomes everyday, but everyday in a good sense as well.
So do you think that there's a sense then, perhaps even a mathematical sense, in which our perceptions are converging on the truth over a long period of time?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, you can think of this, vast. Our idiosyncrasies get washed out over time. I mean, and that's natural. Whether good or bad is probably some of both. But I think over time we tend to converge on the truth, and not with a capital T, but with a very small t. But nevertheless. But so I mean, it is a kind of jaundiced view of the biographical endeavor. I mean, I also talk about offer a kind of defense of hypocrisy. I mean, some forms of hypocrisy are inevitable. If you have a complex situation, it's almost impossible to figure out how to remain consistent. And I mean, there are all kinds of everyday examples. The abortion foe who's had 6 abortions, the gun control person who's got an arsenal in his basement, whatever.
Well, the odd thing is, I find when I'm around New York City, that when I'm driving, those darn pedestrians are always in the way, and when I'm walking, the cars keep trying to run me over.
I know. Reminds me of 2 guys walking down opposite sides of the river, and one of them yells across to the other, "How do I get to the other side of the river?" And the other guy says, "You are on the other side of the river." But there are mathematical theorems. I mean, how do you know if a collection of propositions and propositional calculus can be simultaneously satisfied? It's an NP complete problem. It's very difficult to know. Or if you allow quantifiers, it's impossible to know. And so, I mean, I think we should allow some allowance for hypocrisy. I mean, hypocrisy, to paraphrase, is the homage that truth pays to truthiness.
So we talked about a number of caveats to trying to capture somebody in a biographical sense. The fact that you're always approximating, the fact that the person changes, the fact that everyone has idiosyncrasies that don't, fit within normal parameters. And in some of your other books, you've written about mathematics as a lens for other parts of life. Do those same obstacles lie in the way of our understanding other parts of life besides a person's life?
Yes, but I think to a lesser degree, because people are more complex. I mean, I talk about math and the stock market, math in journalism, mathematician reads the newspaper, math in literature, and so on. But, I mean, there's a saying by Wittgenstein I always liked. He said that he looks forward to the day that philosophy ceases to be a subject in its own right and becomes an adverb. You approach every other subject philosophically. And I don't wish for mathematics to disappear by any means, but it'd be nice if it also was more widespread that people considered mathematics as an adverb. You look at things mathematically. And that gives you a kind of oblique view of things, and the conclusions or the attitudes you come to are much at odds with, kind of contemporary culture. I mean, even just with regard to coincidence, for example. I mean, people always read significance into coincidences, and most of the time they're totally, to be expected. I mean, of one sort or another. Most coincidences are totally meaningless. I mean, there's a fundamental confusion about coincidences in life or in anything else, and that is the confusion between the probability of a specific event or sequence of events, which is almost always tiny, and the probability of some general sort of event, some generic event, and that's almost always quite high. And people conflate the two. I mean, you can always generate coincidences. Just have a dial with the letters around the circumference, spin it 100 times. The likelihood of some word appearing in that link, at least 3 or 4 letter word, is going to be quite high. Probability that chrysanthemum appears in that 100 letter sequence is going to be low. So probabilities of particular events is always tiny. General events are always high. When you look at the first letters of the alphabet, first letters of the months, January, February, March, and so you have July, August, September, October, November, Jason appears. The first letters of the planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, and so on, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Sun appears. Is that significant? Of course not. But
so why do you think it is that people might, come into the office one morning and say, wow, guess what? I saw a license plate on my way into work today that had my birthday on it. What are the chances of that? But we'll never come in and say, oh, guess what? I saw a license plate that said EPX 6357. What are the chances of that? Even though, of course, the chances of either are both, very small.
Right. I mean, I often tell people, if I go to, if they're going to buy a lottery ticket, I say, why don't you just buy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? And they say, that's impossible. That'll never come up.
Right.
But, if they have the analog of your QXR or whatever, that looks more like it. It's a representative heuristic. There are lots of cognitive foibles that I talk about in the book. But, right. Or, there's an earthquake and they rescue at some school and they rescue 3 unfortunate kids who nevertheless survive. That's some miracle, but the 85 who died, oh, well, that's too bad.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So speaking of coincidences, is there any sense in which we can ask a question like, is a typical person's life more ruled by coincidence or more ruled by innately who they are, some essence that you were talking about trying to capture?
It's hard to say, but I think people underestimate the effect of circumstances, of situations. People always say, oh, that's a strong person, or that's and choose your adjective kind of person. But you take that same person, put him in a different situation, even a different corporate culture, and all of a sudden the person is very different. I mean, I think there are traits that people have to a greater or lesser degree, but as I say, people like to believe they're captains of their own ships rather than rafts on a very turbulent sea going whichever way the wind happens to blow.
And so, there's a saying that history is written by the victors. Is there an analog then for that in biography?
I think so. I think you generally don't have biographies of ordinary people, even though they probably don't differ all that much. A lot of it is socially constructed, and I think that is the case in biography as well as in other areas as well.
So as you're putting together these vignettes, did you find one that you thought, this is a perfect mathematical moral. This exactly shows this mathematical principle that I want to get across? Or
sorry,
go ahead.
To finish. Well, I mean, there was one vignette that I talk about that really I think did have an effect on the rest of my life. And I told it in the book, and I mentioned it in Numeracy as well. and that is the following. I was in 5th grade, and we were talking about sports. And my teacher was the gym teacher, the math teacher was the gym teacher, and he was a kind of very tall, hulking guy who was kind of scary. Big bulbous nose, red face, he drank too much. Anyway, I mentioned that this particular Milwaukee Braves pitcher had allowed 5 earned runs the night before and only retired 1 batter. So I said his earned run average was 135. 5 earned runs divided by 1/27th of a game is 135. And he said, you can't have an earned run average more than 27. That's how many outs there are. Sit down. He was very dismissive. And I would get very red, and my hands would shake, and my voice would quaver, and so on. But anyway, at the end of the season, the Milwaukee Journal published the statistics of all the Milwaukee Braves that year, and this particular pitcher had been sent back to the minor leagues, never pitched again. And sure enough, it said his earned run average was 135. So I brought it up at the end of the season to the same teacher, and I said, see? And again, he told me to sit down, and he was visibly annoyed. And kind of barked at me to sit down. But I knew I was right, and what was more important is I knew he knew I was right. And this lesson stuck with me because it seemed like with a little bit of logic, numbers, probability, or whatever, batting averages, and a little bit of logic, you could vanquish blowhards like this guy. And that lesson stuck with me. I mean, that's part of what I've done in a numeracy. A mathematician reads the newspaper is not so much vanquish blowhards, but kind of make clear that people's conventional wisdom isn't necessarily the case. And I think that something like that is useful in pedagogy. I mean, that was horrible pedagogy to embarrass a little kid, but and nevertheless, it had a positive effect, and it seemed like it's something you could sell to kids. That's kind of more motivating than measuring the height of, or estimating the height of a tree across the river using trigonometry.
So I guess to sum that up, then, you found mathematics to be empowering.
Very much so, yes. And
do you think that we could either, through improving education or some other measures, get more people to that point of being empowered through math?
I would like to think so. I kind of do that in my classes, and though there's a Numerate life focuses elsewhere, I mean that message is kind of implicit even there.
All right. Well, my last lick. In the end, looking at it as a whole, is A Numerate Life your autobiography?
To some extent, yes. I mean, obviously, I left out things, and but nevertheless, it's only 200, less than 200 pages. But I think it's a reasonable sample. It gives you maybe flavor of my life. But right. Nevertheless, I caution people to not just my life, but any life. Just say, yeah, maybe.
Okay, very good. Well, that's wonderful. Anything else that you wanted our listeners to hear about?
No. I think that this interview constitutes a little sample of the sample that I provided in A Numerate Life.
All right. Terrific, then.
Thanks a lot, Glenn. I enjoyed it.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.